Welcome to the Rehoboth Beach Museum, our series Conversations on History. Last week we had David McDonald started his program, Ferries, Trains, and Automobiles, Getting to Rehoboth Before the Bay Bridge. Today we will do part two. In part two, he will deal with the automobiles, developing the road network, and the car ferries at Love Point and Mattapique.
And Tolchester.
And Tolchester. Okay. All right. Very good. If you missed part one of the series, you can go to the museum's website and click on videos and audios, and that is posted there, as this will be also once it's completed. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to David and let him tell us all about ferries, trains, and automobiles.
Excellent. Thank you, Marge. I appreciate the introduction. Let me see if I can get some things started here for sharing the screen with you. Okay. How are we doing there? You
muted myself. I'm sorry, I'm muted myself. Looks good.
Looks good? Okay, great. All right, so we're talking ferries, trains, and automobiles getting to Rehoboth Beach before the Bay Bridge. This is part two. Near the close of the last program, we saw two railroad companies and their steamboats providing service for travel between Baltimore and Annapolis, over here on the Western Shore, and Rehoboth Beach and Ocean City. The Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia Railway Company, and the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic Railway Company. Between 1910 and 1912, both lines were at their peak, bringing thousands of excursionists and vacationers to the seashore during the season. The Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic steamers brought passengers from Annapolis and Baltimore to Cleburne on Eastern Bay, where they transferred to the trains bound for Easton, Salisbury, and Ocean City. The Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia steamers brought passengers from Baltimore to Love Point on Kent Island to enjoy the resort there, or to meet the trains bound for Queenstown, Denton, Greenwood, Milton, Lewis, and Rehoboth Beach. The last time we saw this view of Surf Avenue and the boardwalk as an example of how the railroad brought more people to enjoy the beach at Rehoboth, and how that spurred development for the cottages, hotels, boarding houses, and other amenities for the visitors. If we zoom in on this view, we'll see evidence of the next major influence on growth. Yes, there's an automobile parked in front of a house on Surf Avenue. Automobiles started showing up in the United States in the late 1890s. Some were steam-powered, some were electric, but eventually the gasoline engine took the lead. At first, they were a novelty. They were noisy, dusty, temperamental, and they scared the horses on the city streets. But we quickly fell in love with the convenience of going where we needed to go, when we needed to go there. By 1903, there were about 12,000 cars and trucks in the United States and some 2 million miles of unpaved roads. Henry Ford's 1908 Model T became the first widely affordable car. By 1913, the basic sedan cost $525. That's about $13,600 in today's value. As the price decreased, the number of cars on the roads increased, and families began taking advantage of them for recreation, for weekend drives, or going on vacation. But the condition of the roads posed a problem. Getting around by car could be a bit of a challenge. While macadam paving, that is compacted soil covered with layers of stone chip bound by tar, might be found in towns and on major highways. The country roads were often unpaved or of crushed shell, so they were dry, dusty, and bumpy in good weather, and muddy and deeply rutted in bad weather. and many a driver had to call on a local farmer to help continue his trip. The demand for improved roadways began as early as 1890, spurred in part by the rising popularity of bicycles, which needed a firm, smooth road surface. The wheeling clubs for men and women helped initiate the good roads movement, and the need for better roads for farm equipment added support. As automobiles gained in popularity, auto clubs and auto dealers began to lobby for federal and state funds to support road construction and maintenance. By 1915, a national roads movement was underway. The National Highway Association's campaign, Good Roads Everywhere, was pressing for a national network of highways across the country. This map from 1906 shows many roadways in Delaware, but most of them were unimproved. The first major road construction project began in 1911 with Thomas Coleman DuPont's plan to build a major north-south route between Wilmington and Selbyville. Originally planned as a broad dual-lane thoroughfare, the basic 32-foot wide concrete roadbed would not be completed until 1923. In 1917, the Delaware State Highway Department was formed to take over development of state highways. A state aid roads law was passed, which provided $10,000 a year to each county to improve the roads linking county seats and market centers to the major highway routes. Major improvements to existing state roads like Delaware 404 and US 9 continued through the 1920s, converting dirt or shelled roads to macadam or concrete. The link from Georgetown to Lewis and Rehoboth was finally completed by 1925. The Ocean Highway segments, Delaware 1, connecting Rehoboth, Dewey, Bethany, and Fenwick Island, will be completed between 1931 and 1934. The first timber bridge crossing the Indian River Inlet was completed in 1933. By the mid-1930s, the major routes on the Eastern Shore were in place, permitting easier travel between Rehoboth Beach, the lower Delmarva Peninsula, and points north. To assist vacationers, Rehoboth Beach businesses offered brochures like this 1932-33 edition with information about attractions and accommodations, as well as travel advice on highway routes, bus and ferry schedules, and this 4-page fold-out map. This handout, produced by the Rehoboth Chamber of Commerce, shows the suggested routes to reach the beach from Philadelphia and Washington and Baltimore. For vacationers from Baltimore and Washington, of course, getting to Rehoboth required a long trip around the head of the bay down to Rehoboth or crossing the bay by ferry. The earlier steamboat lines serving the Eastern Shore carried automobiles as freight. Some of the first cars to reach Salisbury and Chestertown were shipped by the Weems Steamboat Company or the Colchester Company. We know, for example, that in 1904, Frank Crew of Chestertown took delivery of two 12-seat touring cars to provide shuttle service for the hotels at Colchester and Betterton. Unfortunately, both cars were destroyed in a barn fire the following year. But shipping a car as freight was expensive, and the boats were not designed for drive-on, drive-off service, so it was impractical for tourist use. But 3 separate automobile ferry companies or systems would grow along the established steamboat routes. The Annapolis to Claiborne route, the Baltimore to Love Point route, and the Baltimore to Colchester route. By 1915, the number of automobiles in Maryland and the demand for a Chesapeake Bay crossing had grown. Although a larger sum was requested, the Maryland State Roads Commission appropriated $50,000 to establish a state-owned ferry service to cross the bay from Annapolis to the terminal at Claiborne. Studies were done to determine if the existing terminals were suitable, and the number and types of steamers that would be needed. Despite active support from the governor, and even a proposal to use barges towed by the state steamers Governor McLean and Governor Thomas, those efforts were unsuccessful, and further planning came to a stop. The consensus was that $50,000 would not support the venture, and other needs related to the United States preparation for World War I took higher priority. In fact, the Navy requisitioned the Governor McLean and the Governor Thomas. This is a 1917 photo of the crew of the Thomas in Navy uniform. In 1919, out-of-state investors, with the support of Maryland Governor Emerson Harrington and Attorney General Albert Ritchie, approached the State Roads Commission with a proposal to form the Annapolis-Claiborne Ferry Company. The company would operate the ferry privately with oversight by the State Roads Commission. In return for the $50,000 subsidy, the Roads Commission reserved the right to approve the vessels and retain ownership and control of the terminals, while the company would operate the ferry at a schedule set by the state. The company purchased the steamer Thomas Patton, a 201-foot-long side-wheel steamer built in 1901, and converted her for ferry use. Renamed the Governor Emerson C. Harrington, excuse me, she went into service on June 19, 1919. She could carry 42 vehicles and 1,000 passengers. Automobiles or small trucks would drive up a ramp to the foredeck and then back into what had been the dining salon. The Harrington ran 3 round trips daily during the summer, crossing the bay in about an hour and 20 minutes. One-way fares in 1919 were $2 per car plus the driver, and an additional 50 cents per passenger. Passenger-only fares were 50 cents one way and 75 cents for a round trip. According to longtime employee Frank B. Sherman, the early days were the toughest. During the winter of 1920, the ferry had to suspend service for almost 3 months. A combination of cold weather, ice in the bay, and impassable roads at the Claiborne terminal severely affected business between January and April. A second boat was added to the schedule, the General Lincoln, with a capacity for 13 vehicles. And even though the ferries carried well over 10,000 cars a year, by 1921, the company was in bankruptcy. After his term as governor ended, Emerson C. Harrington became president of the company. Determined to see the ferry system succeed, he established cooperative agreements with the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Electric Railway and the Red Star Coach Company, and actively promoted travel, to and from the Eastern Shore and the ocean resorts in local newspapers. By 1924, the line was beginning to show a modest profit. On July 22nd, 1926, the first double-ended drive-on, drive-off ferry joined the fleet. This was the Albert C. Ritchie. Originally built in 1884, she was 194 feet long and carried 75 to 80 vehicles and 1,200 passengers. In 1928, a second reorganization took place, and the company was renamed the Claiborne Annapolis Ferry Company. Here's an interesting photo. You see here that passengers are coming from the Ritchie, and they're headed for a Red Star coach here, or the WB&A trains, to continue their trip on to Baltimore or Annapolis or wherever they were going. On June 13, 1929, the company's first new construction vessel was placed in service with some fanfare. The John M. Dennis was named for the Maryland State Treasurer. It was diesel-powered. At 215 feet long, she had 6 traffic lanes and carried 65 vehicles and 880 passengers. During the late 1920s, several Maryland road projects were completed that provided better access to points on the Eastern Shore. Articles in the Baltimore and Washington newspapers promoted motor touring, highlighting the improved roads between Washington, Baltimore, and Ocean City, and other points on Delmarva. There was also more discussion of improving the bay crossing by cutting a canal through Kent Island, building new bridges that cross the Chester River, the Choptank, and the Nanticoke, a bridge tunnel to cross the bay, and even a high-speed electric ferry that would cross the bay in 15 minutes. Of these, only the bridges at Cambridge, Chestertown, and Vienna would be completed. But business in the ocean resorts was increasing as well, spurred by advertising in the Baltimore and Washington papers that emphasized the ease of reaching the beach by ferry, bus, and car. In 1930, with a major civic celebration that included Governor Ritchie and other dignitaries, a parade, and a pageant, the Claiborne-Annapolis Ferry opened a new eastern terminal at Mattapique on Kent Island. The young lady seen here is Miss Eloise Ann Palmer of Chester, Maryland, the queen of the pageant. The new location with a clubhouse and a dining hall for waiting passengers shortened the trip across the bay by about 30 minutes and provided easier access to the new Eastern Shore Boulevard that linked Kent Island to the routes on the upper Eastern Shore. The direct ferry service between Annapolis and Claiborne will continue until 1938. Afterwards, passengers would need to take the terminal, leave the terminal at Mattapique and drive 6 miles down Kent Island to a new terminal at Romancoke to catch a shuttle ferry across the bay to Claiborne, and then continue on to St. Michael's, Easton, and Cambridge. By the early 1930s, 2 additional ferry systems were active in the upper part of the bay. The Baltimore to Tolchester Beach route, operated by the Tolchester Company, and the Baltimore to Love Point route along the old Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia line. The Tolchester Company had been providing daily excursion service to its successful amusement park on the bay in Kent County since the 1870s. The steamers Louise and Emma Giles were among the best known boats on the bay, and they provided daily service from Pier 16 at Light Street. By 1925, the resort was thriving, and the company decided to add a car ferry service. The steamers Annapolis, Emma Giles, and Tolchester were modified to carry a limited number of cars on the foredeck, making the run from Baltimore to the Tolchester dock in just over 2 hours. They provided they'd linked to Maryland Route 445 and other routes to reach Rock Hall, Chestertown, and other parts of the upper Delmarva Peninsula. In 1925, the company purchased a double-ended steel side-wheel steamer and reconditioned her with an extra deck so she could carry excursion passengers as well as vehicles. Express, sad to say, was not popular with Baltimoreans. For some reason, going on an excursion trip on a car ferry just didn't seem right. And Express always ran just in one direction. Although she was a double-ender, she made a turnaround at either end of the trip to unload the cars, and that confused the drivers. The Tolchester Company experienced financial difficulties during the 1930s and was bought out by the Wilson Lines. In 1941, a disastrous fire destroyed their Light Street piers and the Tolchester and damaged a second boat. Excursion trips and moonlight cruises on later steamers like Bear Mountain, the Bay Bell, and the New Tolchester would continue up to 1962, but the auto ferry service ended just after World War II. The Baltimore to Love Point ferry, in a sense, continued in the wake of the earlier service. In 1924, the Baltimore and Eastern Railroad, successor to the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic Railroad, shifted its rail service to Ocean City from Claiborne up to Love Point, with a daily service on the steamer Cambridge. In April of 1931, the owners, the Pennsylvania Railroad, chartered a new auto ferry service to run from the Light Street Pier 5 to the terminal at Love Point. Promoted as the largest auto ferry outside New York, the vessel was ready for service in May. The Philadelphia was 200 feet long, 65 feet wide, and could carry 45 vehicles on her car deck, 800 passengers, and freight. She made 3 round trips daily, reaching Love Point in about 2.5 hours. She was painted the railroad's signature Tuscan red, so she was quite a contrast to the gleaming white steamers that Baltimore knew. But she quickly became known around the harbor as Smoky Joe for the heavy black trail of smoke coming from her coal-fired engines. Arriving at Love Point, the passengers could catch the train bound for Denton, Easton, or Ocean City, or drive to other points on Delmarva, or linger for dinner at the Love Point Hotel, before returning to Baltimore that evening. Smoky Joe's heavy steel hull and her powerful engines gave her an advantage in the winter months, and she usually stayed on schedule in the worst weather. Working with the state icebreakers, Latrobe and Annapolis, she often helped clear the shipping channels. And in 1934, she even helped the Annapolis break free of the ice. Smoky Joe was also known as the Good Samaritan of the harbor. During her career, she's credited with rescuing over 200 people from the waters, including 50 passengers from the Baltimore Mail Line's City of Baltimore, which collided with a tanker in 1933, and many survivors of the Chesapeake Line's disastrous fire in the city of Baltimore in 1937. Smoky Joe stayed on the Love Point run except for a brief period in 1935 when her sister ship, the Pittsburgh, took over the route. She resumed service in 1936. Go behind there. She resumed service in 1936 and continued until the ferry route was ended in on August 31, 1947. There we go. After the ferry routes from Baltimore ended, more traffic shifted to the Claiborne-Annapolis ferry crossing at Mattapique. All through the 1930s, traffic on the Claiborne and Annapolis route had increased, and to manage the traffic, expanded schedules and additional vessels were added. The old Governor Harrington was retired in 1937, and the new Governor Harry W. Nice and the new Governor Emerson Harrington II came on in 1938. Still, in summer peak times, vacationers are waiting 3 to 4 hours to cross the bay in either direction. About this time, discussion of the Bay Bridge crossing became more serious. The idea was not new. The first firm proposal came in 1907 for a trolley bridge linking Baltimore and Chestertown. Others followed in 1918, 1919, 1926, 1935, and 1938. Some involved railroad bridges, double-decker bridges, and several were for crossing from Edgemere or Miller Island to Tolchester. The Sandy Point to Kent Island route was considered in 1933 and more seriously in 1938, but plans were put on hold until after World War II. As the discussion grew more serious, the ferry companies were worried about how the bridge spanning the bay would impact their business, and the State Roads Commission began to lobby for control of the ferries. In 1941, the state decided that it had an obligation to compensate the private companies, and the Maryland State Roads Commission purchased the Claiborne-Annapolis Ferry Company for $1,023,000. The new Chesapeake Bay ferry system came into being and assumed control of the operation with the existing boats and many of the same staff. In 1943, in response to the Naval Academy's need for expansion, and I'm sure the traffic jams in downtown Annapolis played a role, the King George Street Terminal was relocated to Sandy Point with new access roads and new ferry docks. Despite ice, fog, bad weather, mechanical breakdowns, and other issues that affected the ferry operation, the service was generally consistent. Summer traffic for the ferries continued to build and expanded schedules, and new vessels like the Governor Herbert O'Connor in 1947 and the V. Frank Sherman in 1949 were added to keep things moving. Okay. Approval and funding for construction of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge was finally in place by 1949, and construction contracts were awarded shortly after. When the bridge construction began, over 70,000 passengers and vehicles were using the ferry each year. And now they were able to watch progress of the bridge construction as they crossed the bay. On July 6, 1952, in an incident that some people found humorous, the steering cable on the John Dennis snapped, and she collided with the pier of the new bridge just off Sandy Point. Passengers were shaken, but no one was hurt. The only damage was the crumpled bow of Dennis and the 4-hour delay in traffic until the ferry service resumed. On July 30th, 1952, formal ceremonies opening the new Chesapeake Bay Bridge started at 10:30 a.m. Governor Theodore McKeldin and former Governor Wilton Preston Lane presided, cutting a ceremonial ribbon at the Sandy Point side, followed by the first motorcade crossing to cut a second ribbon at Kent Island side. The bridge opened up to the public at 6 p.m. with an initial fare of $1.40 per car and driver. In his usual fashion, Baltimore Sun cartoonist Richard Yardley celebrated the opening of the bridge in a July 30th issue, announcing, "The sisters united at last." But not without a wistful note, voiced by many others who were sad to see the last ferry crossing the bay. The ferry service came to an end that day, with free passage for everyone. The last crossing landed at Sandy Point around 8 p.m. As one Baltimore Sun reporter remarked, "One thing is sure, nobody will have to wait in line for them at Matterpeak or Sandy Point anymore." Little did they know, in the first 24 hours after opening, 8,278 vehicles crossed that bridge, including 708 trucks, some of which could not use the ferries because of the cargo they carried or because of their size. And in about 10 years, traffic would increase to the point that drivers were once again sitting in traffic, waiting to pay toll at the Sandy Point facility. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's really, it's amazing, especially since for me, because I can remember taking the ferry. Of course, I'm giving away my age, but once or twice, I do know that we did use the ferry. And the interesting thing is that I had a discussion with a friend one time about how long it took, and they said, "Oh, it couldn't have taken that long, to go over the ferry." And they were someone that went back and forth on the Cape May Lewis ferry. Mm-hmm. And they said, couldn't have taken that long. And I guess I didn't realize all the intricacies of the ferry, of the different places you went. And mm-hmm. So I have no idea how we went. All I can remember is driving onto a big boat, ship, whatever. So anyway, but I want to thank you again, David. This has been so really informative and interesting, and I think people have really enjoyed it. So
there's two interesting things though, Marge. In researching this program, I found that there had been a recent study conducted about, of course, they've been talking about more bay crossings, more bridges recently. But in the process of that investigation, there was a study about the feasibility of resuming a ferry service. I mean, there are very successful ferry services in Puget Sound, for example, out of Seattle, and a number of them over in Europe. But the studies seem to conclude that the cost of building the boats, maintaining the terminals would far outweigh the cost of a new bridge.
Interesting.
which is really
Interesting.
surprising.
Yeah.
The other interesting note is just about 2 years ago, they finally retired the last ferry that had been operating at Annapolis Claiborne. It had been sent out to Oregon and was providing ferry service out there. There were some pictures of it in green and white livery. That there was a inquiry, basically, if anybody was in Maryland was interested in bringing the ferry back here and restoring it as a museum piece,
Oh,
which didn't happen.
yeah. Okay. I wouldn't imagine, but
It's
that
always
would be,
fun, the things that you find when you're researching something.
yeah. So that's
It's
great.
in another rabbit hole. Always.
Oh, okay. All right.